a few language, like, I don't even know if nuance
Yeah.
is the right word, but just a couple of questions, and things that I have come across and questions that I've heard asked. So we have talked about pronouns and their link to, like, I guess, descriptor of gender, if that's the right way to describe it. So what is then is sex versus gender?
Okay. So this is one of those things that in a lot of ways we're still recalibrating socially, and therefore the language is still getting worked on. Okay.
Right.
But the best way you can think of it is sex is your body. Sex is we think of primary sexual characteristics and secondary sexual characteristics. The things that happen at puberty, that sort of stuff, right? That's generally speaking, that's sex. However, there are a lot of folks who aren't quite on board with that interpretation, because that says that, oh, well, I'm a woman with a male body. And I don't really like that, the way that feels. Doesn't feel right. And then, so when we talk about gender, there are actually two things that you want to talk about with gender. There's gender identity,
Okay.
and then there's gender presentation. Okay.
Mm. Okay.
So we'll take all three of them kind of at once here. So gender identity is, and I'm gonna walk this back to like when we're kids. Okay. So gender identity is being a girl. Okay. Gender presentation is being a tomboy. Okay.
Mm.
Now, my sex, my genitals as a kid, as a prepubescent kid, nobody better be asking about my genitals, right? Right. Doesn't matter. Unless they're my doctor and they're going to see me, naked, and it comes into play or something, or later on it's someone who you're becoming intimate with.
Right.
Outside of those two situations, sex really only matters in the context of history. Okay. So when you think about people in your life, you think about first one that comes to mind right now, just because it's topical in my life, is one of my great uncles. So my great uncle he was in the Korean War. Okay. And it turned him into kind of an asshole. I mean, among other things, like, yeah, he's not a nice person. However, we can look at that as part of his history, and we can see how that may have impacted him. Not everybody who goes to war comes back quite impacted the way that he was. And, his impact wasn't as profound as that of someone else. But when it comes to, for me, I was assigned male at birth, which is just a fancy way of saying that when my mom pushed me out, the doctor smacked me on the ass and said it's a boy. Right. And that was really only because I had gonads on the outside of my body. That was it. That was the only criteria. Didn't take into context or like in any possible personal identities, obviously, but it also didn't take into context any kind of intersex conditions, pardon me. Not that those are necessarily wrapped up in gender in the same way that we might assume. However, so that's my history. That means that for me, I came out when I was 25. So I had 25 years of learning how to pretend to be a guy. Okay. And some of that was conscious, some of that was subconscious, right? A lot of it was things I did just naturally to survive. And now as a trans woman, for me, I like to keep that as a part of my identity, that past, because it has shaped who I am. It shaped my view of the world. It's to some degree or another shaped my hobbies, shaped the way that my parents treated me. Not nearly as much as others. I know some folks who grew up with very rigidly, or parents who've really forced a rigid gender binary, but at the same time, I lived in the same world that you did. I saw all the messaging presented to women. So that got worked in there as well, because there's this part of me throughout my whole life before I figured out I was trans that was drawn inexplicably towards this stuff, right? And when I came out, my gender presentation went rather femme. It went quite feminine. And I never quite went what we would call high femme, you know. I've never been a big makeup person even then, but I dove into it. I was like, oh, awesome. This gender stuff is really cool. Or this girl stuff is really cool. But once I got settled into myself, I realized that no, I actually kind of am just a tomboy. You know, I'm a low maintenance physical or like visual. I don't want to put any work into this. My hair is the way it is because that's how I come out of the shower. I'm really lucky with that, by the way.
Your hair is beautiful.
Thank you. However, like that didn't change my gender. So realizing that the way I present myself didn't change the fact that no, actually deep down inside, I'm a woman. Mm-hmm. And that's the closest identity that I have found. Even though I'm kind of creeping into this non-binary world, this world outside of gender or without gender. And yeah, there's the overlap between my gender presentation and my gender identity is, I don't know, probably 50-50. But you go back to the 40s, and the only thing feminine about how I look is this. Everything else about how I look is masculine. I wear shirts and jeans and don't wear, you know, heels or anything like that. I wear runners and boots, and those are all things that a past generation would have said made me male, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, but to go back to sex for a minute, biological sex. So there's a couple of things that are really neat that I have learned. So I started a few years ago, started seeing people talk about, oh, well, so gender is subjective and it is manufactured. It's something that we made up, right? Gender is made up. Like, oh, okay, you know, that makes sense to me, because as a trans person, my gender was made up for 25 years. And then one day I was like, right, I'm gonna come out, I'm gonna do this. And then I started making up my new gender, right? But then I started to see people talk about sex being made up, being invented. And then I started it being subjective. And there's something really interesting when you look at how we, quote unquote, how we sex people or beings. Sometimes we sex them via their gonads, right? Generally, humans are sexed via our gonads. Sometimes we have creatures on this planet, there are animals that have zero sexual dimorphism, physical sexual dimorphism. And so they're identical, whether it's someone who, or, you know, a bird that is sexed male or female, or an insect or whatever, right? And then you start to think, okay, so where's the line then? At what point does one change in a gene just distinguish what we call a genotype from a phenotype, right? Or at what point does, pardon me, what point does a different appearance denote a different phenotype? And you find that like at each point we make a subjective decision, right? You've probably heard, you know, XX and XY, right? Well, XX being female, XY being male. There's like a vanishingly small percentage of humans on this planet who have actually been genotyped. So we do not know if you or I are XX or XY, right? We assume that there's a direct correlation. But in fact, when you start to look into the science of it, turns out that no, actually just most of the time, the genetic marker for androgen sensitivity, i.e. their body is more sensitive to testosterone, it is just more likely to rest on the Y gene as opposed to the X gene. So you can have XY with androgen insensitivity, you can have XX with androgen hypersensitivity, and that's where you start seeing intersex conditions, right? We don't know how many people are intersex. We really have no idea. We would have to genotype everybody. And that's a huge undertaking. And it's pointless, really it is, because the fact of the matter is intersex conditions are just as natural as sex conditions or binary sex conditions. But when you start with, again, with that foundation, and then you start looking at like, okay, well, boobs are not boobs, right? Testes are not testes, ovaries are not ovaries. Then you see that a lot of that is just us making groupings that are fairly subjective. They're not arbitrary, they make sense, like there's rules to them, but they are not hard and fast. And so when you start with that, then you start going, oh, so someone who was born male doesn't really make sense, but someone who was assigned male at birth means that someone looked at them and made a determination. Right. And that determination was based on criteria that are, for all intents and purposes, subjective. Mm-hmm. So I was assigned male at birth. As I understand it, you were assigned female at birth. My gender is female, your gender is female. Both of our gender presentations are female. My sexuality is bisexual. I'm not sure what your sexuality is because we haven't talked about it, but that kind of tells you, you know, it's ways of talking about ourselves that were we to completely wipe the cultural memory and start fresh, blank slate, wouldn't matter. However, because of the cultural memory that we have, because of what happened through the churches, through various societies enforcing their will on each other, through various individuals enforcing their will on society, we are here. Mm-hmm. And so that's why all of this inclusive language is important, I think, because, you know, we have a lot of reason to come up with words for all of the amazing ways that humans present themselves to each other.
Yes. Oh, Katie, you are an exceptional human, and everything
thank you.
You are, and I just even like in you just kind of like listing out those layers of yourself and how they all, like, there's so many aspects and pieces to you, and we don't need to fit in this little conformed box that makes us feel like we get it, right? But like, it's just all of that makes you the beautiful human that you are, and there's so many layers to it. Like, it's not A and B, like, and it doesn't have to be, right?
Exactly. And I think there's categories and categories and categories, and it's all confusing. Yeah. And it's all supposed to be confusing because people are a wonderful mess. And that's what I love so much about humanity. That's why I tell stories in my documentaries of a variety of people, because we are a wonderful mess. And I think that, just as a kind of final thought on the labels side of things, or the boxes side of things, is that for myself, I found that the older I've gotten, I'm 33 now, the less my labels have mattered, because they've helped me find myself. However, the only labels that have mattered are those that have been self-applied. Those that are applied to me by someone else are generally destructive, in my experience,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
And I've struggled with this because I'm also someone who very much lives in my brain really wants to see a diametric black and white existence. I want to be able to draw within the lines. And so for me, one thing that was just mind-blowing was the first time I met someone who I would consider transgender, who did not identify as such.
Oh.
And so while they technically, yes, they fall under the trans umbrella, right? They were assigned a different gender than that which was, or that which they identify with. For me to apply that label to them was offensive.
Okay.
And so this is, again, a case of letting people give you the context that they want to give you, whatever that ends up being. Especially for me, it's, the struggle is talking to people who are older than me and have navigated different parts of this language journey than I have, but haven't done it with the same context that I have. So people who've, gone through, people who came out as trans back in the 80s, would have called themselves transsexuals or transvestites.
Right.
And those are words we really don't like now, because they were applied to us by someone, a doctor, who was essentially saying that we were all fetishists, that the only reason why our gender identity was coming out in this way had nothing to do with who we really were as people, but it was all a fetishization of the female form. And so to look at transsexual and transvestite and say, oh yeah, that's me, doesn't work for me. But I've met a good number of trans people who do fit that umbrella, or do use those labels,
Right.
because that is where they found their safety. So again, with the incredible mess that we are, right? Whereas transgender is actually something that a trans person, as far as I know, a trans person sat down and went, yes, let's go with this. And another trans person said, oh yes, I concur, let's do that. Yeah.
Oh, okay, Katie, I could talk to you and talk to you for hours, because you have such an incredible way of sharing and teaching, and you do it with story, which is clearly why you are a gifted storyteller and filmmaker.